What if your country's entire economy could be choked overnight, without a single missile fired or soldier deployed? No airstrikes, no invasions, just banks, ports, and oil shipments frozen in place. That's not science fiction. That's the power of sanctions. And in 2025, that power has become the weapon of choice in international law's shadow battlefield. You may not see the explosions, but sanctions, economic, financial, diplomatic, have redrawn borders, toppled regimes, starved populations, and brought nations to their knees. From Iran to Russia, North Korea to Venezuela, and now even China, sanctions are no longer just tools. They're tectonic forces shifting the world order. But who gets to impose them? Under what legal authority? And are they even working anymore or simply backfiring on the West? Let's dive into the story of sanctions in international law, where law meets realpolitik and where morality collides with power. In the aftermath of World War II, the global community made a vow. Never again would unchecked aggression or genocidal regimes go unanswered. This vow birthed the United Nations, and with it, a new global legal framework that aimed to replace brute force with rules. Sanctions were part of that system. The UN Charter in Article 41 gives the Security Council the power to impose measures not involving the use of armed force to maintain or restore international peace and security. These include economic sanctions, arms embargoes, travel bans, and more. For decades, these UN-imposed sanctions were relatively rare and highly targeted. South Africa during apartheid, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Yugoslavia during the Balkan Wars. The logic was simple: punish the regime, not the people. But starting in the 1990s and exploding in the 2000s, something shifted. The United States, frustrated by gridlock at the UN Security Council, began using its own economic might to act unilaterally. US financial sanctions became the sledgehammer of foreign policy. Because the dollar rules the global economy, US sanctions have near universal reach, even outside its borders. Today, in 2025, that power is being tested like never before. Let's begin with the elephant in the room: Russia. Since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the EU, UK, and allies imposed the most comprehensive sanctions package in history. Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT. Hundreds of billions in reserves were frozen, oligarch assets seized, export controls blocked access to Western tech. The goal: cripple the Kremlin's war machine and isolate Putin. But more than 3 years later, Russia is still fighting. The ruble has wobbled but not collapsed. Moscow has pivoted to trade with China, India, and the global south. In April 2025, the IMF estimated that Russia's GDP actually grew 2.1% year over year, driven by oil revenues and a surge in military-industrial production. So are sanctions failing? Not necessarily, but they're evolving. The US Treasury has moved to secondary sanctions, punishing third parties who do business with sanctioned entities. In March 2025, Chinese banks and Turkish shipping firms were targeted. Washington even sanctioned crypto mixers that helped Russian entities hide transactions. Still, the effectiveness of these tools is hotly debated. Meanwhile, the legal framework governing sanctions is fraying. International law distinguishes between UN-authorized sanctions, legal under Article 41, and unilateral or autonomous sanctions imposed by states like the US or EU. But here's the issue: there is no global court that adjudicates the legality of these sanctions unless a case is brought before the International Court of Justice, and even then, enforcement is shaky. In 2024, Iran filed a case against the US at the ICJ for violating the 1955 Treaty of Amity by reimposing sanctions after leaving the JCPOA nuclear deal. The court ruled partly in favor of Iran, but the US ignored the judgment, so we're left with a legal system where power determines compliance. And let's not forget the humanitarian angle. The most famous case? Iraq in the 1990s. UN sanctions aimed at Saddam's regime resulted in mass suffering among civilians. By some estimates, 500,000 children died due to lack of medicine and food. a claim famously acknowledged by then U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who said, "We think the price is worth it." That moment sparked a global reckoning about sanctions ethics. Today, similar questions are being asked in Syria, Venezuela, and Iran. In Damascus, sanctions targeting Assad's regime also restrict imports of medical equipment and fuel. In Caracas, U.S. sanctions against Maduro's government contributed to a collapse in healthcare, even as the regime blamed the crisis entirely on Washington. And in Tehran, the reimposed U.S. sanctions led to skyrocketing inflation and drug shortages, even as hardliners gained political ground. In response, humanitarian exemptions are now standard in most sanction regimes. But NGOs argue they're riddled with bureaucratic hurdles. As of April 2025, a joint report by Doctors Without Borders and the Norwegian Refugee Council warned that overcompliance by banks, fearing U.S. fines, prevents legitimate aid from reaching sanctioned countries. It's what some call sanctions chilling, where fear of punishment paralyzes even legal activity. So where does that leave us? Let's bring the focus to China. In 2023 and 2024, tensions over Taiwan, espionage, and tech dominance led to a new wave of U.S. sanctions on Chinese firms, especially in the semiconductor sector. The Biden administration, followed by bipartisan pressure in Congress, banned exports of AI chips to China and imposed investment restrictions on biotech and quantum computing. In return, Beijing launched its own legal offensive, passing the anti-foreign sanctions law, threatening companies that comply with U.S. measures. In April 2025, the WTO received complaints from China accusing the U.S. of violating basic trade rules. Washington responded that national security trumps trade law. In this standoff, legal frameworks matter less than raw leverage. And the private sector is caught in the middle. In January 2025, Apple delayed its planned launch of a new headset in China, fearing regulatory backlash. In March, JP Morgan Chase was fined by Beijing regulators for allegedly aiding a sanctioned foreign agenda. Meanwhile, TikTok's US assets are still under divestment orders, another form of digital sanction. And sanctions aren't just economic, they are travel bans, preventing individuals from entering or transiting through certain countries. There are arms embargoes used heavily in conflicts like Yemen, Libya, and South Sudan. There are diplomatic sanctions, like expelling ambassadors or suspending embassies. One emerging trend in 2025? Cultural sanctions. Countries are now using boycotts of film festivals, sports competitions, and academic exchanges to signal disapproval. Russia was banned from the 2024 Paris Olympics. Chinese scientists were disinvited from a major AI summit in Berlin. These moves may not hurt GDP, but they erode soft power. So where does international law stand? The truth is, sanctions occupy a gray zone. They're legal when imposed by the UN, arguably legal when grounded in national law, but often contested when they violate other treaties or rights. And since international enforcement is weak, the de facto rule is power prevails. Yet that doesn't mean the system is hopeless. There are efforts to reform it. As of April 2025, the UN is revisiting its sanctions framework, considering more targeted smart sanctions that minimize civilian harm. The EU is debating a sanctions tribunal to resolve disputes. And in academia, there's growing interest in codifying due process rights for entities placed on sanctions lists. Because here's the danger. Unchecked sanctions can become tools of economic imperialism. But without sanctions, impunity reigns. It's a balancing act, a moral dilemma, a legal puzzle, and it's becoming the defining foreign policy challenge of the 21st century. So the next time you hear the word sanctions in the news, don't tune out, tune in. They may seem invisible, but their consequences ripple through the price of oil, the strength of the dollar, and the fate of nations. And in a world where conflict is more economic than military, sanctions are not the sidelines. They are the battlefield. What do you think? Are sanctions a force for justice or just modern-day siege warfare? Let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in how international law intersects with real power, hit subscribe. We've got more coming.